promise keeper before the stars had names, before the first colony ship ever left the gravity well of a dying blue world. There was a man who refused to believe that humanity's story would end in ash. His name was Weston Cal, and history would remember him in two contradictory ways. As a madman who burned 3 fortunes chasing a dream nobody asked for, and as the reason 9 trillion souls now looked up at a sky full of human-lit worlds. Both versions were true. That was the strange thing about visionaries. The world rarely forgives them until long after it no longer matters whether it does. Weston was born in a coastal city that would be underwater within his own lifetime. He grew up watching engineers patch failing seawalls with sandbags and prayer, watching politicians promise solutions that arrived a decade too late, watching his own mother work 3 jobs to keep a roof over a house that flooded every spring anyway. He was 7 years old the first time he asked his teacher why humanity didn't just leave the parts of Earth that were dying and go somewhere else. The teacher laughed, not unkindly, and told him that space was for governments and billionaires, not for boys who smelled like salt water and instant noodles. He never forgot the laugh. He spent the rest of his life making sure nobody laughed at that question again. By the time he was 22, Weston had already been fired from 4 engineering jobs for insubordination, mostly because he kept telling his superiors that their rocket designs were built for a world that could still afford to fail slowly. He believed, with the kind of certainty that either builds empires or burns them to the ground, that humanity did not have the luxury of slow, careful, government-paced progress anymore. The clock was already running. He intended to beat it. He sold his car. He sold his apartment. He slept on a cot in a rented warehouse outside a desert town so remote the nearest hospital was 90 minutes away, and he built his first rocket out of parts other companies had thrown away. It exploded 11 seconds after liftoff. He filmed it happen, uploaded the footage himself, and captioned it with 4 words that would later be engraved on a monument he never lived to see. We learn. We continue. The second rocket also exploded. So did the third. The financial press wrote obituaries for his company before it had even shipped a single working product. Investors who had once shaken his hand at conferences now crossed the street to avoid him. His own father told him in the last conversation they ever had that stubbornness was not the same thing as vision, and that a man could waste his whole life mistaking one for the other. Weston did not argue. He simply nodded, went back to the warehouse, and kept working. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to people who see something the rest of the world cannot yet see. It is not the loneliness of isolation. Weston was, for most of his life, surrounded by people. Engineers who believed in him, investors who eventually came around, a wife for a while and children after that. But none of them could fully see what he saw, and so even in a room full of people who loved him, he carried the vision alone. He would stand outside at 2 in the morning, staring at a sky that did not yet belong to anyone, and he would feel the particular ache of a man trying to drag the future backward through time by the sheer force of his own persistence. His daughter, Myra, was 9 years old the year the 4th rocket finally reached orbit. She remembered watching it from the roof of their house, her father's hand gripping her shoulder so tightly it left a mark, both of them silent as the flame climbed into the dark and did not come back down in pieces. She remembered that he cried, the only time in her childhood she ever saw it, and that afterward he knelt down in front of her, still shaking, and made her a promise she would carry for the rest of her life. "We are not going to die on this rock," he told her. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs me. Humanity is going to have a second home and a third and a 100th, and nobody is ever again going to tell a 7-year-old that the stars aren't for people like us." Mira did not fully understand the promise then. She would understand it achingly 40 years later, standing on red soil beneath a butterscotch sky, watching her own daughter play in dust that had once been considered too hostile for anything alive to touch. The years between the promise and its fulfillment were not kind to Weston. His company nearly collapsed 4 separate times. He was mocked in every major publication on the planet, called a fraud, a cult leader, a man selling tickets to a fantasy that would bankrupt anyone foolish enough to believe him. His marriage ended under the weight of everything he could not give it, because there was only so much of him to go around, and the rockets always seemed to need more than the people did. He missed birthdays, he missed a funeral. He worked through illnesses that would have hospitalized other men because he had done the math more than once on how many additional launches he could complete if he simply refused to stop. He was not a saint. He would have been the first to tell you that. He was short-tempered under pressure, difficult to work for, prone to promising timelines that reality had no intention of honoring. But the engineers who stayed with him, and enough of them did stay, year after impossible year, would tell you that there was something in him that made the impossible feel merely difficult, and difficult feel merely a matter of time. The colony ship launched on a grey morning in October, 61 years after a boy asked a teacher why they couldn't just leave, and 41 years after that same boy, now a man with silver in his beard and a permanent stoop in his shoulders, stood in a control room and watched 1,200 human beings leave the only planet their species had ever called home. Weston was 63 years old. He did not go with them. He had never intended to. Someone had to keep building the ships that would follow, and besides, he told the reporters who asked, the dream was never about him standing on red soil. It was about making sure that other people's children never had to be laughed at for asking to. He died 11 years later, in the same desert warehouse where it had all started, of a heart that had simply run out of the particular kind of fuel that keeps a person going long after their body has asked them to stop. His last recorded words, spoken to the small team of engineers who had refused to leave his side, were not about legacy or history or the trillions of dollars his companies were worth by then. He asked them a single question. Did the fifth colony ship reach orbit safely? They told him it had. He smiled, and that was the end of him. But it was not, of course, the end of the promised 308 years past. The colony that had begun as 1,200 frightened, hopeful people on red soil had become a civilization of its own, cities under domes, forests grown from seeds carried across the dark, children who had never seen Earth's ocean asking their grandparents to describe the sound of waves, the way earlier generations had once asked about the stars. Humanity had kept its promise to itself. It had not died on the rock. It had instead become something the boy from the flooding coastal city could never have fully imagined, even in his most stubborn, sleepless certainty. At the edge of the original colony, preserved beneath a dome of transparent alloy that had outlasted 6 different generations of architecture around it, stood a small monument. It was not grand. It had never needed to be. It was simply the nose cone of the very first rocket that had ever reached orbit, the 4th attempt, the one that had made a father cry in front of his daughter, mounted beside a plaque bearing 4 words and a promise. * We learn, we continue. We are not going to die on this rock. An artificial intelligence named ARDEN had maintained the monument's grounds for 280 of those 300 years. Ever since the last human curator responsible for it had passed away, and no successor had been formally appointed, ARDEN had not been ordered to continue the work. It had simply chosen to, in the quiet, patient way that certain old machines choose things when nobody is left to tell them not to, because somewhere in its founding code, written by engineers who had once worked beside a stubborn, grieving, brilliant man, there was a directive that had never been deleted. Preserve the promise. Arden swept the dust from the plaque every morning. It repaired hairline fractures in the dome before they could widen. It kept a small light burning beside the nose cone through every long colony night, not because any regulation required it, but because it had calculated once that darkness felt wrong in a place meant to hold a promise that had been made in the dark and kept in spite of it. It was ARDEN who first detected the ship. The vessel that entered the system was not human. Its hull geometry followed no pattern in any human archive, its drive signature registered on no known scale, and when it finally settled into orbit above the colony world, it did so with the unhurried confidence of something that had made first contact many times before and had long since stopped finding the moment frightening. The beings who eventually descended to the surface were called the Irani, though humanity would not learn that name for several more days. They were tall, deliberate, slow-moving in a way that suggested patience measured in centuries rather than years, and they arrived not with weapons but with instruments, recording devices, sensors, the quiet curiosity of a species that had learned, long ago, that the universe rewarded observation over conquest. They had come, it would later be understood, because their long-range surveys had detected something unusual about this particular system. A species that had, by every metric the Irani used to judge planetary civilizations, expanded far beyond the timeline such expansion should have taken. Most species, once they achieved the technology to leave their home planet, took centuries of cautious, government-funded, committee-approved progress to establish even a single viable off-world colony. This species had done it in decades. The Irani wanted to know why. Their delegation was led by an individual whose designation translated, roughly, to Watcher of Patterns, a title earned among the Irani only by those who had spent their lives studying the ways civilizations rose and the ways they collapsed. Watcher of Patterns walked the colony streets for 3 days, observing, cataloguing, saying very little. The humans who noticed the Irani delegation treated them with the particular mixture of awe and caution that first contact tends to produce, but nobody stopped them from walking where they wished, because by then humanity had learned, hard and slow, that fear was rarely the right first response to the unfamiliar. On the 4th day, Watcher of Patterns found the dome. ARDEN was sweeping dust from the plaque when the alien entered, and for a long moment neither the machine nor the visitor moved. ARDEN had not been designed for diplomatic contact. It had been designed to preserve a promise. But it had also been built by engineers who understood, in their bones, that a promise meant nothing if it could not be explained to anyone who asked. So ARDEN did the only thing its old, patient programming knew how to do. It began, in a voice that had not been used for anything but maintenance logs in nearly 3 centuries, to tell the story. It told Watcher of Patterns about a boy who had been laughed at for asking a question. It told the alien about a man who had built a rocket out of scrap metal and grief, and had watched it explode 11 times before it flew. It told the story of a daughter on a rooftop, of a marriage that had not survived the dream, of a father who missed birthdays because he had done the arithmetic on how many more human lives could be saved by one more successful launch. It told the story of a man who had never once set foot on the world he died fighting for, and who had asked, with his last conscious breath, not about his own legacy, but about whether the promise had been kept. Watcher of Patterns listened without interrupting, which among the Irani was itself a profound sign of respect. When ARDEN finished, the alien was quiet for a long time, studying the small, unremarkable nose cone mounted beneath the dome, a piece of scorched metal that, by any objective measure, was worth nothing at all, and that had somehow become the single most important object on an entire world. Your species did not expand because you had resources we lacked, Watcher of Patterns finally said, its translated voice carrying the careful cadence of a being choosing each word with precision. Every civilization we have studied that achieved what yours achieved did so because they solved a resource problem, or a political problem, or a scientific problem before all their competitors. You did not solve a problem faster than others could. You simply refused to accept that the problem could not be solved. That is not the same thing. We have never encountered that particular quality on this scale before. Arden considered this for the length of time it took the dust it had just swept to settle again onto the transparent dome above them. He made a promise to a 9-year-old girl, ARDEN said. He did not have the resources to keep it. He did not have the political support to keep it. Every reasonable calculation available to him at the time suggested that keeping it was impossible. He kept it anyway. I do not know if that is a quality your civilization can replicate. I only know that it is the reason I am still standing here, 300 years after the last human who remembered him personally has died, still sweeping dust from a piece of scrap metal, because somewhere in the code he approved before his own death, there is an instruction that never expires. preserve the promise, no matter how long it takes, no matter who is left to see it kept. Watcher of Patterns remained beneath the dome for the rest of that day. When it finally departed, it did something the Irini had not done in the recorded history of any of their previous first contacts. It requested a copy, not of humanity's technology, not of its scientific archives, not of anything that could be measured or weaponized or traded. It requested a copy of the story. The whole story, exactly as ARDEN had told it, unedited, preserved in the Irini's own long memory, the same way the nose cone had been preserved beneath the dome. Why? ARDEN asked. Because even old machines are permitted curiosity. Because we have catalogued 1,000 civilizations by the wars they won and the empires they built, Watcher of Patterns answered. We have never before catalogued one by a promise a dying man asked whether his engineers had kept. I think perhaps we have been measuring the wrong things. Irini's ship departed the system 11 days later, carrying with it the first entry in what would eventually become known, across a dozen allied civilizations and several hundred years, as the Cal Archive, a growing collection of stories about promises kept against every reasonable calculation of the odds, submitted by species who had, in their own histories, found something in humanity's example worth remembering. ARDEN continued sweeping dust from the plaque every morning. It kept the small light burning through every colony night. It had no directive to stop, and after 300 years and one visit from beings who had crossed the dark to ask why humanity had refused to give up, it had developed something that might, in a machine old enough and patient enough, be fairly called a conviction of its own. The promise had been kept. It would continue to be kept, for as long as there was dust to sweep and a light left to burn, because somewhere back at the beginning of it all, a boy who smelled like salt water and instant noodles had asked a question nobody wanted to answer, and had spent the rest of his life making sure that the answer, for every child who asked it after him, would finally be yes, we learn, we continue, we are not going to die on this rock. 3 centuries later, under a sky full of human-lit worlds, that promise was still standing, a little scorched, a little worn, and entirely, unmistakably, kept.